very difficult to deal with. There's another form of market failure called moral hazard, which is if you're insured, you then have no incentive to reduce your costs. So everybody knows that. We get a cold, we say, oh, I need a brain scan. I may have cancer. We're not paying the cost of the brain scan, the insurers are paying it. That's moral hazard. Again, and I'll apply in a minute, it turns out to be quite important in financial markets too. So there's two big examples not to do with finance, healthcare, and global warming, both of them very topical, which are ultimately forms of market failure. So I run through them and various other, as I say, forms of what I call reality-based economics, including some behavioral economics, some of the theories that Schiller and Akerlof and people have come through. There have been other books on that, so I won't. Some of you may have read those. I won't dwell on that, but there are chapters in there about that. Then the final third of the book, which is sort of the meat of it in a sort of narrative sense, I try and apply these ideas to what happened in the financial crisis. And as I say, I've dismissed greed, I've dismissed stupidity, I've dismissed the government, so I better have something else to say. What do I have to say? What I have ultimately to say is that this is an incentive problem. The market, as I said in the first part of the book, the market's great defense is it provides good incentives in some areas. In financial markets, though, we saw it provides bad incentives. Friedrich Hayek called the market mechanism a telecommunications system. And he said the prices are signals. That's exactly right. What Hayek didn't realize, or was reluctant to admit, was that the signals the market can send out, especially in a speculative bubble, can be the wrong ones. Once you get speculation started, prices depart from fundamentals, and then the incentive structure gets completely out of whack. So what I do in the book, I take you, if you think of the subprime mortgage problem, which is obviously underlies all this, I take you through the chain from the people who are buying the houses, the people who are issuing the mortgages, the mortgage brokers, the mortgage lenders, people on Wall Street who are securitizing the mortgages, the people, the investors, the hedge funds and banks, etc., who are buying the subprime mortgage securities, and the regulators, and the credit rating agencies who are rating the bonds. Seems to me, in every one of these cases, the incentive structure was misaligned. If you just think of the I won't go through them all, but let's just focus on a couple of them. The mortgage brokers and the people issuing the securities, and the people issuing the mortgages. Why would they conceivably give $300,000 to some guy out of work in East LA who is buying a house maybe 10 times his income if he had a job? The answer is, there are two answers. Number one, because of securitization, they didn't think that they'd be holding the mortgages. Obviously, in the old days, if you issued a mortgage and you were a mortgage lender, you kept it on your books for 30 years. If the guy defaulted, you were in trouble. If you'd issued that mortgage, you had to explain to your boss why you did. In this case, because of securitization, firms like Ameritrade and Countrywide and all the others, they really didn't give a damn who they're giving the mortgages to, as long as Wall Street was willing to buy them. And for a long time it was. So the mortgage, standards completely evaporated. The famous ninja loans, no income, no jobs, no assets. As long as you could stand up and sign your name, you could get $250,000 to buy a house. I mean, and it got to the stage where we're not even sure if you bought it, because they were issuing these things so quickly, a lot of the paperwork was never put through. So in a lot of cases, there's famous cases in Ohio where the judge has thrown out the foreclosure judgments because the bank can't prove that the guy owned the house, because they were too busy issuing mortgages to actually fill in the paperwork. It seems to me, that's an example. Now on Wall Street then, most of the attention's been focused on Wall Street. Why did the banks, all these smart people, get involved in this thing? This is where my theory of what I call rational irrationality comes in. And I think the idea basically is that it was rational for them to do things which they knew ultimately could well turn out to be irrational. The example I use in the book is Chuck Prince, chairman of Citigroup, who obviously has been pilloried from A to Z since the whole thing blew up. Actually, if you go and look at the history of Citigroup, they were far from the worst offender. From 2000 to 2005, they had a home mortgage department, a sort of housing finance for lower income people, but it wasn't one of the big securitization machines. They were lagging behind Merrill Lynch and Countrywide and various others. So much so that in the start of 2005, the board came to Prince, the board of directors, including Bob Rubin, the former Treasury Secretary, and said, look, we're falling behind our competitors. We need to do something, to catch them up. We need to increase our risk profile. We're not taking enough risks. Now, what should Prince have said? Well, obviously, in retrospect, he should have said, you're crazy, it's an august institution like Citigroup doesn't want to bet its future on people who can't afford their mortgages. It's all going to blow up. But there were very few people saying that at the time. And given the incentive structure Prince faced, given the enormous, short-term stock options he had, given that he was judged on a quarterly or an annual basis, and given that he was already under pressure for not doing what everybody else was doing, he would have probably lost his job if he'd have said the sensible thing and said, look, we shouldn't get involved in this. Now, is this my theory of what happened, or is it Prince's theory? I think Prince himself understood the logic of this very well, and actually the one thing I would like to read in the book very quickly is a reference to an interview with Prince in 2007. This was in July of 2007, when the market was already starting to crack. So one of the Bear Stearns hedge funds had got into trouble, I think. And Citi was they were big in subprime at that stage. They were also big in LBOs, which was also starting to crack. Prince went to Japan, and he must have been outside his usual security cordon or something, because the FT managed to catch up with him, the Financial Times, and they asked him a question. And as I said, I should say, 2 weeks before this, it was, in fact, the Bear Stearns hedge funds had lost 3.2 billion, I think it was. So anyway, in June 2007, just a few weeks before Prince's Financial Times interview, as I say, the Bear Stearns hedge funds had blown up. Prince conceded that a full-scale blow-up in subprime could cause liquidity to dry up in other asset-backed securities markets, leaving Citi and other banks saddled with numerous loans of questionable value. Still, he insisted, Citi had no intention of pulling back, he said. He said, the depth of pools of liquidity is so much stronger now than it used to be, and a disruptive event now needs to be much more disruptive than it used to be. At some point, the disruptive event will be so significant that liquidity, instead of filling in, will go the other way. I don't think we're at that point. As long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. Now, that's now what I think will go down as one of the sort of quotes of the decade. And as I say, whether he knew it or not, Prince was channeling Keynes, who in chapter 12 of the General Theory pointed to the inconvenient fact there's no such thing as liquidity of investment for the community as a whole. Whatever the asset may be, stocks, bonds, real estate, or anything else, if everybody tries to sell it at the same time, prices will collapse and the market will seize up. Given this possibility, Keynes said, financiers were forced to keep a close eye on the mass psychology of the market, which could change at any moment. And he said, this is the inevitable result of investment markets organized with a view to so-called liquidity, referring back to the quote there. Now, for it is, so to speak, a game of snap of old made of musical chairs, a pastime in which he is a victor who says snap neither too soon nor too late, who passes the old maid to his neighbour before the game is over, who secures a chair for himself before the music stops. These games can be played with zest and enjoyment, though all the players know that it is the old maid which is circulating, or that when the music stops, some of the players will find themselves unseated. Now, it seems to me, if you compare those two quotes, they're very similar. It seems to me Prince knew exactly what he was doing, and it was just, responding to the incentive structure quite rationally from his narrow point of view. But of course, when everybody does that, you get a blow up. That's my theory of rationality. And a secondary piece of evidence to support this, which actually comes from Andrew Ross Sorkin, he was telling me the other day that he was talking to John Mack, the head of Morgan Stanley, and Mack was basically saying, look, we can't regulate ourselves. Somebody else has got to come in. The government has got to come in and impose some rules. You can't leave it to Wall Street, because given where I sit, and he's the chairman of Morgan Stanley, there's no incentive for me to draw back from this thing, from risky situations. So I think the smart people on Wall Street know what happened. They know it wasn't just greed. I mean, that's why I think they're so angry, being pilloried all the time. Now, of course, some of them are greedy, so they deserve some criticism. But I don't think that was the primary force at fault here. So that's my sort of theory of the crisis. Then in the final chapter or two, I just try and take us up to where we are now, and I'll just spend a minute on that, and maybe if anybody has questions, they can ask me more detail on that. Seems to me the government did a pretty good job preventing a return to the 1930s. I think that Fred did a terrible job getting us into this mess by keeping interest rates too long and provoking a speculative bubble. But I think once they realized at the end of 2007, end of 2007 really, that things were really serious, they shifted to pumping money into the markets, reduced interest rates to zero. I think they did a good job. I think Hank Paulson, for all the criticism he gets, did what needed to be done. He screwed it up by first going to this sort of complicated TARP structure where they were going to buy back the bonds, but they pretty quickly realized that that wouldn't float, and then they decided to recapitalize the banks. Very unpopular thing to do, still very unpopular, but I think it did avert a catastrophe. So if you add those two things together, and maybe a bit of kudos for Obama for introducing a stimulus package, which has had, I think, some impact, I think we've successfully avoided the mistakes of the 1930s when the Fed basically let the banks go under. That was Milton Friedman's great insight, and he was right on that. You can't just let the banking system collapse, much as some of Friedman's actual followers in Chicago would like to now. They say, you know, just let it collapse and everything will come back in a few weeks. As I say, I think we tried that in the 30s. I think that didn't work. So short term, I think the government did a good job. Long term, I'm a lot less sanguine. I think the administration has made a strategic error in not trying to reform Wall Street first and focusing on healthcare. Because now we've got the situation whereby the market's coming back, the banks are making a lot of money, they're a lot more cocky, the lobbyists are empowered again, and the sort of political imperative to do something about Wall Street has sort of diminished. It looks like the healthcare is going to take the next, 2-3 months. It's going to be at least the start of the year, possibly the spring, before we get on to financial regulation. By then, you're sort of into midterm election season. That means politicians need to raise a lot of money. Who do they raise the money from? They raise it from the banks and Wall Street. So it seems to me even the administration's pretty moderate regulation ideas for re-regulation, which I'll address in question and answer. I don't think they go far enough. But even those relatively modest reforms, it seemed to me, are by no means certain to be put through. If I'd have, and obviously, nobody asked my opinion, but if they had done, I would have done it the other way around and exploited the great sort of revulsion at Wall Street in the public at the start of the year to try and put some big reforms through quickly and to keep the laser focus on the economy. Then when you get that through, switch to healthcare. So I think that was a political error on the part of the White House. I can understand why they did it. He'd obviously campaigned on healthcare, but I think they should have pirouetted and gone for financial regulation first. And I think it was probably a political economy error, and we may live to regret it. So that's pretty much all I got to say in a half an hour, I think. I'm happy to answer questions on any aspect of that or anything else I didn't cover.
Well, I thank you really very much for making the irrational rational.